But the big expenses are going to come after the war, when we have to rebuild all the things that we destroyed.
Sean, Israel is rapidly losing support amongst its allies across the world, I guess for obvious reasons. There is, however, a big difference between talking and doing. And I guess the doing is how that support that talking translates into military equipment. Can you tell us exactly what's happening?
Yeah, it's been what you're talking about here is that American frustration with Israel, as well as the world getting very frustrated about the level of the casualties, and a topical story which we'll get on to. But America is still providing huge amounts of weapons to Israel. Literally, earlier on the week, another $3 billion worth of aid. It's worth saying again, $3 billion of aid coming from America. Now, over the years, the decades, America has provided literally hundreds of billions of dollars of military aid to Israel, but it's topical at the moment. This latest package includes 25 F-35 stealth fighters, 2,300 bombs. So they're clearly doing some resupply. And Israel gets about just under 70% of its weapons from America. Do you know where it gets most of the rest of them from? Germany. 28%. So nearly all of the remaining comes from Germany, with a little bit elsewhere. Interestingly, the US also stockpiles a lot of weapons in Israel, probably, God forbid, the day that ever Israel needs military help from the US. So there's a little bit of that involved as well. Why it's topical, though, is the International Court of Justice, when it made its ruling, remember South Africa was pushing it, it made a ruling that said that it was going to be, Israel needs to do more to protect the Palestinian population. And it also, if you look through international law, it said that it's illegal to supply weapons to a country if you know that they're going to use them in violation of international law. So at the moment, there are grave concerns at the approach Israel is taking. Several countries have therefore stopped exporting weapons. 3 of them are Canada, Japan, and Spain. The Netherlands has stopped providing Israel with spare parts for the F-35, the fast jet that's doing airstrikes as well, which all sounds against that backdrop. Why are America continuing to supply weapons? Well, part of it is obviously historical, but are these countries that are blocking, not sending weapons, actually making a difference? The answer is no. The Israeli Defense Force, in addition to F-35, they also fly F-15s and F-16s. They've got lots of other aircraft. The F-35, the biggest single operator of F-35s in the world, is America. So they've got lots of spare parts, lots of weapons. America can pick up the slack. So it feels like that these weapons conversations are more of a political statement of concern than actually going to have a material impact on the ground for Israel.
In other words, they're doing the talking, maybe for virtuous reasons, but maybe some of the doing isn't necessarily following suit. And I picked up on a news program a couple of days ago that America, there's 2 ways in which America can deliver support, military support to Israel or anybody else. One is above the line, where there has to be political decisions being made to do it. And the second is below the line. And if you get an amount, a level of support below the line, it's hard necessarily for everybody to sort of find out about it. And I heard, it might be wrong, but it's something for us to investigate, that there's been about 100 shipments of military support to Israel that have been done by Joe Biden in America below the line. In other words, they wouldn't fall into your 3 billion category. And that's like a shipment every 2 days. If that's true, that's a lot.
Yeah, and I think part of this goes back to the political element here, isn't it? That with that we don't have the time, but given the historical, the foundation of Israel, America still feels responsible for guaranteeing security for Israel, and that has, in the decades since, meant that America has made huge provision militarily and financially to make sure that Israel stands on its feet. It doesn't always mean that you agree with everything that Israel does. It's a bit like a father and his son. You might be help bring them up, educate them, or whatever. You may not always agree with what they do.
You might chastise them occasionally,
but you still feel a moral obligation towards them. And I sense that's what's happening here at the moment. Although there are a lot more Machiavellian views now being aired around the whole defence industry. I know you were looking into the presidential election and some of the conversations that are happening around that, around weapons as well.
Yes. Well, one of the things is when you use up all your stock, whether it's yourself or via somebody else, they need to be replaced. And this particular issue has been picked up in the American presidential race. Robert Kennedy Jr., who's now become actually quite a big figure.
Famous name in politics.
Very famous, and carries a lot of votes in the US. He's looked behind the scenes. Listen to what he has to say about the military business in the US and the world.
This is a war that should have never happened. It's a war that Russians tried repeatedly to settle on terms that were very, very beneficial to Ukraine and us. The major thing they wanted was for us to keep NATO out of the Ukraine. The big military contractors want to add new countries to NATO all the time. Why? Because then that country has to conform its military purchases to NATO weapon specifications, which means certain companies, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, General Dynamics, Boeing, and Lockheed, get a trapped market. In March of 2022, we committed $113 billion. Just to give you an example, we could have built a home for almost every homeless person in this country. We then committed another $24 billion since then, 2 months ago, and now President Biden is asking for another $60 billion. But the big expenses are going to come after the war, when we have to rebuild all the things that we destroyed.
Yeah, so what Kennedy is saying is actually, possibly quite outrageous. On the other hand, it is a view that's held by a lot of people. In other words, there is another machine behind this, and that machine is fed on this type of activity to grow its base. And BlackRock, the big organisation that sits above all the defence contractors, is the largest asset manager in the world. There's something in excess of $10 trillion under management. Now, if half of what Kennedy is saying is true, it's another big subject, which I guess we and other people are going to be looking at.
Yeah, and it is an interesting one because some of the articles you're referring to and certainly talk about companies like BlackRock having too much power, too much influence. And there's a lovely film, wasn't there, Tail Wagging the Dog, where actually are people deliberately inciting violence because then that consumes armaments and therefore that generates a huge amount of demand signal. I think the problem with this whole topic is the vast sums of money involved. Weapons are very expensive. We used to live in a world, even in the Cold War, where you'd procure weapons just enough to have a decent sized stockpile, little bit of risk, and that would be it. Today, those stockpiles have been emptied, and the rate of consumption of those weapons far exceeds what the defence industry can deliver. Just one example we had the other day was one of the waves of strikes of Putin against Ukraine. Because of the numbers of missiles involved and the value of those missiles, it was $1 billion of weapons used in one night. Now, somebody's got to replace those, and that is creating a huge demand signal. You can't do that overnight. You need the defence industries to step up and increase their manufacturing capability. That needs investment. Where does that money come from? And that's where private equity companies and companies like BlackRock provide the oil in the machine that makes our democracy, our capitalist society work. The challenge is, at times like this, when weapons are being consumed at an incredible rate, and there are literally trillions of dollars worth of demand signals. Russia has stopped exporting, well, virtually stopped exporting weapons because it's using all the ones it wants. The West is trying to pile its available stock into Ukraine. When Ukraine finishes this war, will it stick with former Soviet Union equipment, tanks, ships, aircraft, munitions, shells, because it's always going to have second-rate weapons if it buys them from Russia? Or is it going to start saying, hey, Mr. Lockheed Martin, hey, Mr. Northrop Grumman, can we start operating Western weapons? Now, that's a massive market opportunity. But again, none of the weapons companies can suddenly step up. And it means there's a really interesting dynamic behind all of this about where companies like BlackRock, who are incredibly powerful, have huge political influence. Are they simply at one end of the demand signal, or where they start to influence some of our political masters? And that's the bit that I don't think we'll ever get to the back of. But Kennedy is alluding to that murky, dark shadows where companies like this might operate.